The rain hammered against the windows of Highgrove House as Charles sat alone in his study. The fire crackled softly in the corner, casting dancing shadows across the mahogany bookshelves. It had been 3 months since Diana's funeral, and the high silence in the house felt heavier than ever before. He had been avoiding this room, avoiding the memories that lived within these walls. But tonight, something pulled him here. Perhaps it was the loneliness, or maybe the guilt that had been eating away at him since that terrible day in Paris. Charles walked slowly to the old oak desk where Diana used to sit when she visited. She would often write letters here, her blonde hair falling gently over her shoulders as she concentrated on the paper before her. He could almost see her there now, her blue eyes focused, her lips slightly pursed in thought. The desk had remained untouched since her last visit. Even the housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, had been instructed to leave everything exactly as it was. Charles wasn't sure why he had given that order. Perhaps he wasn't ready to let go of the last traces of her presence. As he approached the desk, something caught his eye. Behind a small stack of books about charity work, there was a corner of leather peeking out. Charles frowned and gently moved the books aside. There, hidden from view, was a small brown leather diary with a tiny golden clasp. His heart began to race. Diana had always been private about her personal writings. During their marriage, she would often disappear for hours, writing in various journals and diaries. Charles had respected her privacy then, never asking what she wrote about, never trying to peek at her words. But now she was gone, and this diary had been left behind like a message from beyond. Charles picked up the diary with trembling hands. It was worn and well used, the leather soft from countless hours of handling. The golden clasp was tarnished, and he could see where Diana's fingers had worn smooth spots on the cover. He sat down heavily in the chair, the same chair where Diana had sat so many times before. The diary felt warm in his hands, as if it still held some of her life force within its pages. Should he open it? Was it right to read her private thoughts now that she could no longer consent? Charles stared at the diary for what felt like hours, wrestling with his conscience. Part of him desperately wanted to know what she had written, to understand her thoughts during their final years together. But another part of him felt like he would be violating her trust. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed midnight, its deep notes echoing through the quiet house. Charles looked up at the portrait of Diana hanging on the wall opposite his desk. It had been painted during happier times, when William was just a baby. In the portrait, Diana was smiling, her eyes bright with joy and hope for the future. "What should I do, Diana?" he whispered to the empty room. "Would you forgive me for reading this?" The only answer was the continued drumming of rain against the windows and the soft crackling of the fire. Charles looked down at the diary again. On the front cover, in Diana's elegant handwriting, were the words, "My Private Thoughts, 1996-1997. Those were the final years of her life, the years after their divorce when their relationship had been so strained and complicated. His thumb traced over her handwriting, remembering how she used to write him little notes during their courtship, sweet messages about her day, her thoughts, her dreams for their future together. When had those loving notes turned into formal communications through lawyers and palace officials? A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, making Charles jump. It was as if Diana herself was trying to tell him something. He took a deep breath and slowly opened the clasp. The first page was dated January 15, 1996, just 2 months after their official separation had been announced. Diana's handwriting was as beautiful as ever, but Charles could see the slight shakiness in the letters, a sign of the emotional turmoil she must have been feeling. "I don't know where to begin," the first entry read. "Everything has changed so quickly. The boys are confused. The press won't leave me alone. And Charles feels like a stranger to me now. How did we get here? When did the man I married become someone I barely recognize?" Charles felt his throat tighten as he read her words. He had known she was hurting during those days, but seeing it written in her own hand made it feel so much more real and painful. He turned the page and found another entry from a few days later. "I saw Charles today at William's school play. He looked tired and sad. For just a moment I remembered why I fell in love with him all those years ago. But then Camilla called him during the intermission, and the spell was broken. I wonder if he even realizes how much that hurt. Camilla. Even seeing her name in Diana's handwriting made Charles wince. The situation had been so complicated, so painful for everyone involved. He had tried to do what he thought was right, but clearly, he had failed Diana in so many ways. Charles continued reading, each entry revealing more of Diana's inner world during those difficult months. She wrote about her charity work, how it gave her purpose when everything else in her life felt uncertain. She wrote about Harry and William, how proud she was of them, how worried she was about the effect the divorce would have on their young minds. But it was her entries about him that cut the deepest. She wrote about their early days together, about the hopes she had harbored for their marriage, about the gradual realization that they wanted different things from life. "I know Charles never meant to hurt me," she wrote in one entry from March 1996. "I think he's as trapped as I am, just in a different way. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we had been different people, if we had met under different circumstances. Could we have made each other happy?" As Charles read these words, tears began to blur his vision. He had to set the diary down and take several deep breaths. This was harder than he had expected. Diana's pain, her confusion, her lingering love for him despite everything that had happened, it was all there on the pages, raw and honest and heartbreaking. Outside, the storm was growing stronger, and Charles realized he was not prepared for what else he might find in these pages. Charles wiped his eyes and picked up the diary again. The fire had died down to glowing embers, but he didn't notice the growing chill in the room. He was completely absorbed in Diana's words, each entry pulling him deeper into her world during those painful final years. The next entry was dated April 3, 1996, and it was longer than the others. Diana had written about a conversation she'd had with William, who was only 13 at the time. Charles could picture his eldest son trying so hard to be mature beyond his years, attempting to comfort his mother during one of her darker moments. "William asked me today if Daddy and I would ever get back together," Diana had written. "The hope in his eyes nearly broke my heart. How do you explain to a child that sometimes love isn't enough? That sometimes two people can care deeply for each other but still be completely wrong together?" I told him that his father and I both love him and Harry more than anything in the world, and that would never change. But I could see he wasn't satisfied with that answer. Charles remembered that period vividly. William had become so serious, so protective of both his parents. There had been several occasions when his son had tried to mediate between them, suggesting family activities or asking innocent questions about why they couldn't all live together anymore. Each time, Charles had felt like a failure as a father. He turned several pages, skipping through entries about Diana's various charity commitments and her struggles with the media attention that never seemed to fade. Then he found an entry that made him pause. It was dated July 20th, 1996, just days after their divorce had been finalized. "It's done," Diana had written. "I am no longer the Princess of Wales in any official sense. Strange how a lifetime can be reduced to legal documents and official statements. Charles came to see me today to discuss the boys' summer holiday arrangements. He was kind, almost gentle, and for a moment it felt like we were simply two parents trying to do what's best for our children. No palace officials, no lawyers, no press, just Charles and Diana, trying to navigate this new reality." He apologized again. The entry continued, not just for the divorce, but for everything, for the pressure, for the expectations, for not being the husband I needed him to be. I could see the pain in his eyes, and I realized that he's been suffering too. We've both been trapped in a story that was written for us before we ever had a chance to write our own. Charles set the diary down and walked to the window. The storm had passed, and the first hints of dawn were appearing on the horizon. He had been reading all night, lost in Diana's thoughts and memories. Her words were forcing him to confront truths about their relationship that he had spent years trying to avoid. He returned to the diary and continued reading. The entries from late 1996 and early 1997 showed a different Diana, one who was finding her footing as a single woman, discovering her own identity outside of the royal family. She wrote about her growing confidence in her charity work, particularly her campaign against landmines. She wrote about her friendship with various celebrities and public figures who seemed to understand her in ways that the royal family never had. But there were also darker entries, moments of loneliness and despair that cut Charles to the bone. "Sometimes I feel so isolated," she wrote in November 1996. "The boys are at school. My work keeps me busy during the day, but the evenings are the hardest. I sit in this big house surrounded by beautiful things, and I feel completely alone. I wonder if this is what the rest of my life will be like." There were entries about men she had dated, her hopes for finding love again, her fears about bringing someone new into her complicated world. Charles found these particularly difficult to read, not out of jealousy, but because he could see how desperately Diana wanted to be truly loved and understood. One entry from February 1997 particularly struck him. "I had lunch with Charles today to discuss Harry's progress at school. He seemed different, lighter somehow, more at peace with himself. I think his relationship with Camilla is giving him the happiness he never found with me, and I'm surprised to find that I'm genuinely glad for him. We were never right for each other, but that doesn't mean he doesn't deserve to be happy." Charles felt tears streaming down his face as he read these words. Even after everything they had been through, Diana had found it in her heart to wish him well. How had he been blessed with such a generous spirit in his life? And how had he failed so completely to appreciate her while she was alive? The entries from spring and summer of 1997 showed Diana at her most vibrant and hopeful. She wrote about her plans for expanded charity work, her excitement about William and Harry growing into such wonderful young men, her dreams for her future. There was a lightness to her words that had been missing in the earlier entries. "I feel like I'm finally becoming the person I was meant to be," she wrote in June 1997. Not the Princess of Wales, not Charles's wife, not the boy's mother, but simply Diana. "It's taken me 36 years to figure out who that person is, but I think I'm getting there." She wrote about her relationship with Dodi, her growing feelings for him, her hope that she might have found someone who could love her for herself, rather than for her title or her fame. "Dodi makes me laugh," she wrote in July 1997. "He sees the woman, not the princess. When I'm with him, I feel young and carefree in a way I haven't felt since I was a teenager." But there were also worries in those final entries. Concerns about the media attention her relationship with Dodi was generating, fears about how it might affect William and Harry, uncertainty about what the future might hold. The last entry was dated August 30th, 1997, the night before her death. Charles's hands shook as he read her final written words. "Paris tomorrow with Dodi. I'm nervous about the photographers, but also excited about what lies ahead. For the first time in years, I feel like I have a real future to look forward to. I hope Charles is happy too. I hope we can both finally find the peace that has eluded us for so long." Charles closed the diary and wept openly for the first time since Diana's funeral. Her final thoughts had been generous, hopeful, and even included a wish for his own happiness. She had died still carrying love in her heart, not just for their children, but even for him despite everything that had gone wrong between them. Charles sat in his study as the morning sun streamed through the windows, Diana's diary clutched against his chest. The weight of her final words pressed down on him like a physical burden. He had expected to find anger in these pages, bitterness about their failed marriage, perhaps even hatred for the way their story had ended. Instead, he had found something far more devastating: forgiveness, understanding, and a love that had evolved beyond romantic attachment into something deeper and more enduring. The sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Patterson, his longtime housekeeper, appeared in the doorway with a worried expression on her weathered face. "Your Royal Highness," she said softly, "you've been in here all night. I've brought you some tea and breakfast." Charles looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes. Mrs. Patterson had worked for the royal family for over 30 years. She had seen him and Diana during their courtship, their marriage, their struggles, and their eventual separation. If anyone understood the complexity of their relationship, it was her. "I found something, Mrs. Patterson," Charles said, his voice hoarse from crying. "I found Diana's diary." The elderly woman's face softened with understanding. She sat down, the tea tray, and closed the door behind her, ensuring their privacy. "Oh, Your Highness," she said gently. "Perhaps that's not something you should—" "She forgave me," Charles interrupted, his voice breaking. "After everything I put her through, all the pain I caused her, she forgave me. How is that possible?" Mrs. Patterson approached slowly and sat in the chair across from his desk. She had been more than just a housekeeper over the years. She had been a confidant, almost a maternal figure to both Charles and Diana during their most difficult times. "The princess had the biggest heart of anyone I've ever known," she said, quietly. "Even when she was hurting, she always found room in that heart for forgiveness. That's what made her so special, sir." Charles opened the diary again, turning to a passage he had marked with his finger. "Listen to this," he said, and began to read aloud. "I understand now that Charles never meant to hurt me. The system, the expectations, the weight of tradition, it crushed both of us in different ways. I was angry for so long, but anger is exhausting. I choose to remember the good times instead. The way he looked at me on our wedding day, how gentle he was when William was born, the pride in his eyes when I gave my first major charity speech. Those moments were real, even if everything else fell apart." Mrs. Patterson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "She said something similar to me once, about a year before the divorce was finalized. She was here picking up some things for the boys, and she found an old photo of the two of you at a polo match. She stared at it for the longest time, and then she said, we really did love each other once, didn't we, Mrs. P? Before everything got so complicated." Charles felt fresh tears threatening to spill over. "I failed her in every way that mattered. I was so focused on duty, on what was expected of me, that I forgot to simply be a husband, a partner, a friend. But you were those things, sir, at least in the beginning," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "I remember how you used to surprise her, with flowers. How you would cancel meetings just to spend time with her when she was pregnant. You tried to make her happy, Your Highness. The circumstances were just impossible." Charles turned through more pages of the diary, landing on an entry from December 1996 that he had found particularly moving. "She writes here about Christmas that year, the first one after our divorce. She talks about watching William and Harry open their presents, how they kept asking if I would visit later. She writes, I told the boys that their father was spending Christmas with the Queen as was proper, but later, when they were asleep, I found myself wishing Charles could have been here just for a moment. Not as my ex-husband, but as their father. As the man who once helped me put together William's first bicycle on Christmas Eve, cursing at the instruction manual while I laughed until my sides hurt. Those memories don't disappear just because a marriage ends." Mrs. Patterson smiled through her tears. "I remember that bicycle. You were so determined to assemble it yourself, even though you could have asked anyone on staff to do it. The princess thought it was the sweetest thing, how important it was to you to do it personally." "I had forgotten about that," Charles admitted. "I had forgotten so many of the good moments. It became easier to focus on the failures, the ways we disappointed each other." He continued reading, sharing passages with Mrs. Patterson that revealed Diana's deepest thoughts about their relationship, their children, and her hopes for the future. There were entries about her growing friendship with various celebrities and activists, her increasing confidence in her public role, her determination to use her platform for good. But it was the entries about their sons that affected Charles most deeply. Diana had written extensively about William and Harry, their personalities, their struggles with their parents' divorce, their hopes and dreams for the future. "William is so much like his father," she had written in March 1997. "He has that same sense of duty, that desire to do the right thing even when it's difficult. Sometimes I worry that he'll make the same mistakes Charles did, putting obligation before happiness. But he also has something Charles didn't have at that age. He's seen what can happen when duty and love are in conflict. Perhaps that will make him wiser than both of us were." About Harry, she had written, Harry is my free spirit, my rebel. He reminds me of myself at that age, full of life and energy, sometimes impulsive, always passionate about the things he believes in. I worry about him more than William because I see how much he feels everything. The divorce, the media attention, the pressure of being a royal. It all affects him so deeply. I hope he never loses that beautiful open heart of his. Charles looked up from the diary to find Mrs. Patterson watching him with concern. The boys, he said suddenly. They should know about this. They should know what their mother really thought about all of us. Mrs. Patterson hesitated. Are you sure that's wise, sir? Prince William and Prince Harry have found their own ways to cope with their mother's death. This might open old wounds. Charles considered this carefully. The boys had been through so much already. William, now 15, had become incredibly mature and responsible, perhaps too much so for his age. Harry, 13, still struggled with emotional outbursts and anger about his mother's death. Would reading Diana's private thoughts help them or hurt them? She loved them so much, Charles said, turning to another passage. Listen to this. My greatest achievement in life will always be William and Harry. Not my charity work, not my royal duties, but raising two boys who are kind, compassionate, and genuine. Whatever mistakes Charles and I made in our marriage, we got that right. They are the best of both of us. Mrs. Patterson stood up slowly, her old knees creaking. Perhaps you should take some time to process all of this before making any decisions. Your Royal Highness, this is a lot to absorb all at once. Charles nodded, knowing she was right, but as he looked down at the diary, he realized that reading Diana's words had changed something fundamental inside him. For the first time since her death, he felt like he was beginning to understand not just what they had lost, but what they had actually shared during their years together. 2 days had passed since Charles discovered Diana's diary, and he found himself unable to concentrate on anything else. His official duties felt meaningless compared to the revelations contained within those worn pages. He had barely slept, barely eaten, spending most of his time either reading and rereading Diana's words or staring out the windows of Highgrove, lost in memories. This morning, he had made a decision that surprised even himself. He had called William and Harry, asking them to come to Highgrove for the weekend. He hadn't told them about the diary yet, but he knew he couldn't carry this burden alone any longer. William arrived first, driving himself in the small car Charles had given him for his 15th birthday. Despite his youth, William carried himself with a dignity and composure that reminded Charles painfully of Diana. Harry came shortly after, brought by his protection officer from Ludgrove School, where he was still boarding. The three of them sat in the informal sitting room, the same room where Charles and Diana used to have their morning coffee during happier times. The boys seemed puzzled by their father's sudden invitation, but neither questioned it directly. They had learned to be cautious around their father's moods since their mother's death. "Boys," Charles began, his voice unsteady, "I need to share something with you. Something I found here at Highgrove a few days ago." William straightened in his chair, his blue eyes, so much like Diana's, focused intently on his father. Harry, fidgeting with a loose thread on his sweater, looked up with curiosity and a hint of wariness. Charles reached for the diary, which he had placed on the side table next to his chair. "I found your mother's diary," he said simply. "Her private thoughts from the last 2 years of her life." Both boys froze. Harry's face went pale while William's expression became carefully neutral, a defense mechanism he had developed to protect himself from emotional pain. "Dad," William said quietly, "are you sure we should—" "She wrote about both of you," Charles interrupted gently. "So much about how proud she was, how much she loved you, how worried she was about the effect of our divorce on your lives." Harry's composure cracked first. "What did she say?" he asked, his voice small and vulnerable in a way that broke Charles's heart. "Was she angry with us? Did we make things worse for her?" Charles immediately moved to Harry's chair and knelt beside him. "Oh, Harry, no. Never that. She was never angry with you boys. Here, let me read you what she wrote about you." Charles opened the diary to a passage he had bookmarked. "This is from February 1997, he said, and began to read. Harry came home from school today with a drawing he made in art class. It's a picture of our family, all four of us, standing in front of a house with a rainbow overhead. When I asked him about it, he said he drew it because rainbows mean everything will be okay. I started crying, and he got worried that he had upset me. How do I explain to a 12-year-old that his drawing didn't make me sad, it made me hopeful? He has such a beautiful, optimistic soul. Even with everything that's happened, he still believes in happy endings. Harry began to cry, and William moved closer to his younger brother, putting an arm around his shoulders. Charles continued reading other passages about Harry, Diana's pride in his kindness to other students, her delight in his sense of humor, her hopes for his future. Then he turned to passages about William. "She wrote this about you in April 1997, Charles said to his eldest son. "William amazes me every day. He's developing such wisdom and maturity, but I worry that he's growing up too fast. Today he asked me if I was lonely, and when I hesitated to answer, he said, 'It's okay if you are, Mum. I get lonely sometimes too, even when people are around.'" How did he become so perceptive? I see so much of his father in him, the desire to take care of everyone around him, sometimes at the expense of his own happiness. William's carefully maintained composure finally broke, and tears began streaming down his face. "I remember that conversation," he whispered. "I was worried about her all the time." "She knew that," Charles said, finding another passage. "She writes here, 'William thinks he needs to take care of me, and it breaks my heart. He's only 14, but he's already carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. I see him watching me when he thinks I'm not looking, making sure I'm all right. I need to find a way to show him that it's okay to just be a boy sometimes.'" The three of them sat together, sharing Diana's words, her hopes, her fears, her immense love for her sons. Charles read passages about family holidays, about quiet moments at home, about Diana's pride in watching William and Harry grow into young men with strong moral compasses. But it was the entries about Charles himself that proved most difficult to share. After reading numerous passages about the boys, William looked at his father with red-rimmed eyes and asked, "What did she write about you, Dad?" Charles hesitated. Some of Diana's thoughts about him were deeply personal, revealing not just her pain but also her continuing love and concern for his well-being. How much should he share with his teenage sons? "She was kinder to me than I deserved," Charles said finally. "Even after everything that went wrong between us, she still cared about my happiness. Can you read us some of it?" Harry asked quietly. Charles found a passage from May 1997, one that he felt was appropriate to share. She wrote, "I saw Charles at Harry's cricket match today. He looked tired, older somehow. I realized that this divorce has aged both of us in ways that have nothing to do with time. We were both so young when we married, so full of hope and expectations that neither of us could possibly fulfill. I don't hate him anymore. I can't. He's the father of my children, and despite everything, I know he loves William and Harry as much as I do. That has to count for something." William was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Finally he said, "She forgave you?" "Yes," Charles said, his voice breaking. "She did. And I don't understand how or why." Harry wiped his eyes with his sleeve. "Because she loved us," he said with startling clarity for a 13-year-old. "And she couldn't hate the person who helped give us life." The wisdom in his younger son's words struck Charles like a physical blow. Harry was right. Diana's forgiveness had come not from weakness, but from her fierce love for their children and her understanding that hatred would only poison that love. William stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens that Diana had loved so much. "What happens now?" he asked without turning around. "What do we do with this information?" Charles didn't have an answer. Reading the diary had changed something fundamental in his understanding of his relationship with Diana, but he wasn't sure what that meant for the future. He only knew that for the first time since her death, he felt like he was beginning to heal. The weekend at Highgrove stretched into 3 days as Charles, William, and Harry found themselves unable to leave the cocoon of shared memories and revelations that Diana's diary had created. They talked late into the nights, sharing stories about Diana that they had never told each other before, processing emotions that had been buried since her death. On the third evening, as they sat in the garden where Diana used to read to the boys when they were younger, William brought up something that had been troubling him. "Dad," he said carefully, "there's something I need to tell you about Mum's funeral." Charles looked up from the diary, which had barely left his hands since he'd found it. Harry, who had been lying on the grass looking at the stars, sat up with interest. "What about the funeral?" Charles asked, though something in William's tone made him apprehensive. William took a deep breath. "I was angry with you that day. Really angry. When we were walking behind the coffin, all I could think about was how you had made her unhappy, how maybe if you had tried harder she would still be alive." Charles felt his heart break a little more. "William, let me finish, please," William said quietly. "I blamed you for everything. The divorce, her loneliness, even the accident. I thought that if she hadn't been trying to escape the photographers, if she hadn't felt like she needed to find happiness somewhere else, she would still be here with us." Harry was listening intently, his young face serious in the growing darkness. Charles remained silent, knowing his son needed to say these things. But reading her diary, William continued, "Seeing how she really felt about everything, I understand now that it wasn't that simple. She wasn't just trying to escape from you. She was trying to escape from a whole system, a whole way of life that didn't fit who she was meant to be." Charles nodded, tears threatening again. "Your mother was extraordinary, William. She had a light inside her that the royal family, that I, tried to dim without meaning to. We had rules and traditions and expectations, and she needed freedom and authenticity and room to be herself." "She writes about that," Harry said suddenly. "I remember this one part where she talks about feeling like she was performing in a play, where everyone else knew their lines but her." William looked at his younger brother with surprise. Despite being the more emotional of the two, Harry had often shown remarkable insight into human nature, especially their mothers. "That's exactly right," Charles said. "And I was so caught up in my own role in that play that I forgot to help her learn her lines, or better yet, to question whether the play itself was worth performing." The three of them sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the last light fade from the sky. Then William spoke again, his voice stronger now. "I've been thinking about what you said about Mum forgiving you," he said. "And I realize that I need to do the same thing, not just for you but for me. I can't carry this anger anymore, it's too heavy." Charles reached over and took his eldest son's hand. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, William. I failed both of you boys as well as your mother." "Maybe," William said simply. "But Mum's diary shows that people can fail each other and still love each other. She failed sometimes too. She writes about times when she was so sad that she couldn't be the mother she wanted to be, when she was so angry that she said things she regretted." Harry nodded vigorously. "She writes about this one time when she yelled at both of us for fighting, and then she felt terrible about it for days. She kept apologizing, even though we had already forgotten about it." Charles smiled despite his tears, remembering Diana's tendency to overthink her parenting decisions. She wanted so badly to get everything right with you boys. She was always reading books about child psychology, asking experts for advice, worrying that she was somehow damaging you. "But she didn't damage us," William said firmly. "She made us who we are. The good parts of us anyway." "The good parts of you come from both your parents," Charles said. "Your mother's compassion and intuition, but also her strength and determination. You have those qualities too, both of you." Harry had been quietly contemplating something, and now he spoke up. "Dad, what are you going to do about Camilla?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Charles had been dreading this conversation, knowing it would eventually come up. Diana's diary had made several references to Camilla, some bitter, Some surprisingly understanding. What do you mean? Charles asked carefully. Mom writes about her sometimes, Harry said. She wasn't always angry about it. Sometimes she seemed almost grateful. William looked shocked. Grateful? Harry nodded. There's this one entry where she talks about seeing you and Camilla together at some event, Dad. She writes about how you seemed happier, more relaxed. She says... Harry paused, trying to remember the exact words. She says something like, Charles deserves to be with someone who understands his world in a way I never could. I hope Camilla makes him happy, because his happiness matters to our boy's happiness. Charles was stunned. He remembered the event Harry was referring to, a charity function where Camilla had attended as a friend of other guests. He hadn't realized Diana had been watching them, or that she had drawn such generous conclusions from what she observed. Your mother, Charles said slowly, was a far better person than I ever gave her credit for being. William was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Finally, he said, If Mum could forgive you and if she wanted you to be happy, then maybe we should try to understand that too. The weight of his 15-year-old son's wisdom hit Charles like a physical force. Here was William, barely more than a child himself, offering the kind of mature perspective that Charles had been struggling to find for months. I loved your mother, Charles said quietly. I want you both to know that. It wasn't the right kind of love for marriage, but it was real. And I love Camilla differently, in a way that works better with who I am, who we both are. Harry surprised them both by asking, Does Camilla know about the diary? No, Charles said. No one knows except the three of us and Mrs. Patterson. Maybe she should know, Harry said thoughtfully. Not everything, but maybe she should understand what Mum really thought about things. It might help her not feel so guilty about everything. Charles looked at his younger son with amazement. Harry, who had always been the more impulsive and emotional of the two boys, was showing a depth of empathy that reminded Charles powerfully of Diana. You think Camilla feels guilty? Charles asked. Of course she does, William said. Anyone would. She probably thinks we hate her, that Mum hated her, that she's the reason everything went wrong. The boys were right, Charles realized. Camilla did carry enormous guilt about the situation, about her role in the breakdown of his marriage to Diana. She had never said so directly, but Charles could see it in the way she carefully avoided any mention of Diana around the boys, the way she seemed to shrink into herself whenever the topic of his first marriage came up. There's something else, William said, his voice becoming more tentative. Something I've been thinking about since we started reading the diary. What is it? Charles asked. Mum's work, her charity commitments. What's happening to all of that? Charles felt a stab of guilt. In the months since Diana's death, he had been so consumed with his own grief and the boys' immediate needs that he hadn't given much thought to the continuation of Diana's charitable work. The various organizations are carrying on, he said. But you're right. Her personal involvement, her passion for those causes, and that's been lost. Harry sat up straighter. We should do something about that. We should find a way to continue what she started. You're both still quite young for that level of public commitment, Charles said carefully. Not now, William said. But someday, when we're older, when we understand better what she was trying to accomplish, we could make sure her work doesn't just disappear. Charles looked at his sons with pride and sadness intermingled. They were growing up so fast, forced into maturity by circumstances beyond their control. But they were becoming remarkable young men, combining Diana's compassion with their own unique strengths. She would be so proud of both of you, he said. Not just for what you're saying now, but for who you're becoming. The three of them continued talking as the night grew deeper, sharing more passages from the diary, more memories of Diana, more hopes for how they could honor her legacy while still building their own lives. As the weekend drew to a close, Charles realized that something fundamental had shifted in their family dynamic. The wall of grief and blame that had stood between him and his son since Diana's death was beginning to crumble, replaced by a deeper understanding of the complex web of love, duty, and circumstance that had shaped all their lives. but he also knew that the hardest conversation was still ahead of him. He needed to talk to Camilla about what he had discovered, about Diana's surprising forgiveness and understanding. He needed to find a way to bridge the gap between his past and his future, between the love he had lost and the love he had found. The diary had given him answers to questions he hadn't even known he was asking. But it had also raised new questions about how to move forward, how to honor Diana's memory while still allowing himself and his family to heal and grow. As William and Harry prepared to return to their respective schools, Charles made a silent promise to Diana's memory. He would do better. He would be the father she had wanted him to be, the man she had believed he could become. He would find a way to make their story not just one of tragedy and failure, but also one of love, forgiveness, and hope for the future. 3 weeks had passed since that transformative weekend at Highgrove, and Charles found himself standing in the drawing room of his London residence waiting for Camilla to arrive. He had asked her to come for dinner, telling her only that he had something important to discuss. The diary sat on the table beside him, its worn leather cover a tangible reminder of the journey he had taken through Diana's thoughts and feelings. When Camilla arrived, Charles could see the concern in her eyes immediately. Their relationship had been strained since Diana's death, both of them struggling with grief, guilt, and the uncertainty of their future together. "Charles," she said softly as he kissed her cheek in greeting, "you look different, better somehow." He led her to the sitting area where they had shared so many quiet evenings over the years. Camilla settled into her usual chair, but her posture was tense, as if she was preparing for bad news. "I need to tell you about something I found," Charles began, picking up the diary. Diana's diary, her private thoughts from the last 2 years of her life. Camilla's face went pale. "Oh, Charles," she whispered. "Should you have read that? Should you be telling me about it?" "I think Diana would want me to," Charles said gently. "After reading her words, I believe she would want both of us to understand what she really felt about everything." Over the next hour, Charles shared carefully selected passages from the diary with Camilla. He read Diana's words about forgiveness, about understanding the impossible position they had all found themselves in, about her genuine desire for Charles to find happiness. Camilla listened in stunned silence, tears streaming down her face as she heard Diana's thoughts about their relationship. When Charles read the passage about Diana seeing them together at the charity event and hoping that Camilla made him happy, Camilla broke down completely. "I destroyed her life," she sobbed. "I came between you and your wife, between your boys and their mother. How can you sit there and tell me she forgave any of this?" Charles moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "Because Diana understood something that we're all still learning. Love isn't always simple or convenient or fair. Sometimes people love each other but aren't right for each other. Sometimes the timing is wrong or the circumstances are impossible. That doesn't make the love any less real or important." "But the boys," Camilla said through her tears. "William and Harry must hate me. They must blame me for everything that went wrong." Charles thought about his conversation with his sons, about their surprising maturity and capacity for understanding. "They don't hate you, Camilla. They're hurting, and they're confused, but they don't hate you. William said something to me that I think Diana would have been proud of. He said that if their mother could forgive me, then maybe they should try to understand and forgive too." Camilla looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "What does this mean for us, Charles? Where do we go from here?" It was the question Charles had been asking himself for weeks. Reading Diana's diary had freed him from some of the guilt and anger he had been carrying, but it had also made him more aware of the responsibility he bore to honor her memory and protect their children's emotional well-being. "I think," he said slowly, "it means we move forward with honesty and integrity. Diana wanted me to be happy, but she also wanted William and Harry to grow up knowing they were loved and valued. Any future we build together has to include them, has to consider their needs and feelings." Camilla nodded, understanding the implications. "I've always known that. Your boys come first, as they should. I would never want to replace their mother or compete with her memory. Diana writes about that too, Charles said, finding another passage in the diary. She says here, I hope that someday when the boys are older, they'll understand that loving their father doesn't mean forgetting me, and that Charles finding happiness with someone else doesn't diminish what we had together. Love doesn't work like mathematics. Adding new love doesn't subtract from what came before. The wisdom in Diana's words struck both of them. She had understood, even in the midst of her own pain and confusion, that love was expansive rather than limited, that honoring one relationship didn't require destroying another. She was remarkable, Camilla said quietly. I always knew that, but reading her actual thoughts, she had such a generous spirit, even when she was suffering. Charles nodded, thinking about all the passages in the diary that revealed Diana's complexity, her pain and her forgiveness, her anger and her love, her struggles and her triumphs. She was human, he said, beautifully, completely human. She made mistakes, she had regrets, she struggled with jealousy and hurt feelings just like anyone would. But underneath all of that, she had this incredible capacity for love and forgiveness. They talked long into the evening, processing not just Diana's words but their own feelings about the past and the future. Charles shared stories about his weekend with the boys, about their growing maturity and their desire to honor their mother's legacy. Camilla talked about her own guilt and uncertainty, her love for Charles balanced against her awareness of the pain their relationship had caused. As the night grew late, Camilla asked to hold the diary for a moment. She traced Diana's handwriting on the cover with one finger, her expression thoughtful and sad. Thank you for sharing this with me, she said finally. I know it couldn't have been easy. Diana's last entry, Charles said, was written the night before she died. Her final written words were about hope for the future and a wish for my happiness. How can I not honor that? How can I not try to build something positive from all the pain and loss? Camilla handed the diary back to him. What will you do with it now? Charles had been considering this question for days. I think I'll give it to the boys when they're older, when they're ready to fully understand and appreciate their mother's thoughts and feelings. For now, I'll keep it safe. And us? Camilla asked. What happens with us? Charles took her hand and looked into her eyes. If you're willing, we move forward together. Slowly, carefully, with respect for Diana's memory and consideration for William and Harry's feelings, we build something honest and genuine, something that honors the past while still allowing for happiness in the future. Camilla squeezed his hand. I'm willing, she said. I want to try. As Charles looked at the woman he loved, holding Diana's diary in his other hand, he felt something he hadn't experienced since that terrible night in Paris. Hope. Diana's words had given him permission to move forward, to stop punishing himself for the failures of their marriage and start building a future worthy of her forgiveness. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be public scrutiny, family tensions, and the ongoing challenge of blending their love story with the legacy of his marriage to Diana. But for the first time since Diana's death, Charles felt like he understood what she would have wanted for all of them. Not perpetual grief and guilt, but healing, growth, and the courage to love again. The diary had revealed not just Diana's secrets, but also the path forward. A path marked by forgiveness, understanding, and the radical idea that love in all its forms was worth fighting for.